Welcome to today's webinar. This is going to be all about podcasting and how you can make your podcast a success. Your host for today is Matt Gilroy. He is the L&D Free Spirits wizard of podcasts. If you haven't already checked out our podcast, it launched on Monday, so you can find it on all of your podcasting hosting tools, Spotify, Apple Music, all of that kind of thing. Without further ado, I will hand over to Mark. I'll be looking after chat, so any questions, you can either put them in Q&A or chat, and I'll just be helping out behind the scenes. So enjoy, everybody.
Thanks so much, Kim. Thank you for looking after the chat too. I've only got one pair of eyes. It's really helpful to have someone there. And amazing to hear some of your podcast recommendations in the chat. Adam Buxton podcast is one of my absolute favorites, Andy. I'll give another shout out for Adam. And I've actually got a picture of him later on. So if you've never heard of Adam Buxton's podcast, I can highly recommend checking that out. So this is all about unlocking podcast success. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully you've got a sandwich or something with you. Maybe you're tuning in while you're refreshing your stomach, and hopefully it can refresh your mind too over the course of the next 45 minutes. For those of you we've never met before, I can see some familiar faces there on the chat. So David, Andrew, Joe, we've met several times before, so it's really good to see you here. A little bit about me to kick off. So I've worked in the learning and development industry as a coach and consultant for over 2 decades, and I've also featured as a guest on over 20 different learning and development industry podcasts. Alongside that, I do host my own podcast, which is called the Team Performance Podcast, as well as very recently, as Kim hinted there, stepping into the hosting seat on the new podcast which we launched this week, which was called the Free Spirit of L&D, which is designed for freelancers in this space. When I'm not doing that, I also create content elsewhere. I've got a pretty successful YouTube channel, which has drawn over 3 million views in the last 3 years, which is just kind of boggles my mind sometimes when I see some of that stuff. So that's a very small potted history, but hopefully goes towards sharing that I do know the challenges of having to make it all happen and trying to come up with systems that really optimize this stuff. Maybe if you've only got a small team, or maybe if it's just you in the driving seat, I do know what that's like. So we are going to get on and take a look at some of these areas. We're going to be looking at podcasts, particularly why are they an important part of your toolkit when it comes to promoting your business? And maybe you might be wondering, isn't it a bit too late to start a podcast, given that everyone seems to have a podcast now? Some people have too. Maybe you're thinking about that, but we're going to talk about why you should absolutely start a podcast, and particularly why you should do that now. We're also going to look at the 3 main reasons that podcasts fail. And I'm going to share a little process and a tool to help you find your podcasting superpower. Now, I can see you've already got some suggestions of podcasts to listen to in the chat, which is brilliant. Keep them coming. In terms of participating today, feel free to carry on using that chat feature as a bit of a back channel. So I will pause every now and again. I'm sure Kim will also pause me if we've got anything that's burning in terms of a question, but don't wait until the end. If you've got a question, if you've got a comment, if you've got a reflection, ideas, challenges, even kind of resources, whether you've got like some books or videos or definitely podcast recommendations, put all of that in the chat as and when it comes to you. Don't feel like you need to wait around for that. And then likewise, if you want to engage with other people on the call, you can just use the @ button, write their name so that they know that they're referencing something that you've said as we go along. There will be some time for some open Q&A at the end of the session. So if you've come with a particular question in mind, you can hang on to it. We might cover it over the course of the next 45 minutes. Okay, great. Let's get started. So I'd like you to imagine in the chat that this little cute alien has just landed on planet Earth and they want you to explain to them what podcasts are. How would you describe a podcast to this little guy? What would it be? Pop your thoughts in the chat. And think why she's doing that. I think it's so interesting that kind of since podcasts arrived on planet Earth, which was about 20 years ago, they've really evolved an awful lot. And the kind of the meaning behind them, the formats of podcasts have changed so much. But right here, right now, how would you describe what a podcast is? Yeah, so Joe's gone with something that you can listen to. I think this is true. I think a lot of people would think of podcasts as primarily, and I will say primarily, an audio format. There are some exceptions to that idea, but yeah, very much so. To learn things or be entertained, absolutely agree, Joe. Andrew's going with a series. I like that word. So hang on to that thought. The idea of podcast as a series, um, audio or video, which can be downloaded or streamed on demand. This is really important. So the idea that you can listen to it on your own terms. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, Mark has suggested here, these are delivered automatically to your device. So yeah, that is something you subscribe to and it just gets delivered to you. You don't really need to have much involvement in going out and finding it. Brilliant. David, a way of listening to people discussing stuff you're interested in. Love that. Really good way of explaining it, particularly to an alien. And I've got a great picture to capture that idea in a second, David. Andy looks at it as an audio magazine. I love that. There's a really excellent series of podcasts that I listen to called The Modern Man, Man with two N's, which describes itself in that way, like a magazine show with lots of different sections and segments to it. It's a really unusual way of kind of positioning a podcast. And Andrew says he's not a fan of video podcasts. Interesting. I'd be interested to know why that is the case, Andrew, because they are getting very popular. Right. Wonderful. Thank you, folks. So yeah, it is generally quite conversation based. I think when I described this to my parents a little while ago, I described it to them like talk radio, but you don't have to turn up on the day when it's being broadcast. You can have it whenever you want. And for me, a good podcast is very much like a good conversation. And sometimes rather than describing what a podcast is, for me, it's much easier to describe how it feels. And this is quite a famous meme that's been flying around for a while, but I am always that guy there in the red cap, sort of feeling like you are listening in with either a group of people that you know and that you feel comfortable and familiar with. I would tune in every episode and it's just like hanging out with this group of people that I feel like I know and I can't wait to hear what they've got to say about something. So that's what we're kind of aiming for. I think really good podcasts really capture that feeling of wanting to engage and wanting to feel like you're part of that conversation. Now, in terms of a brief history of podcasts, I'm going to show you a picture, and I don't know about you, but this kind of gives me a bit of a pang of nostalgia. This is probably one of my favorite ever pieces of tech that I've owned, the original iPod. And because of this, the word podcast has got its roots in the kind of early 2000s. I used to have one of these. Primarily, of course, iPods were things that you used to load music onto, that you downloaded. But also later, they introduced this idea of being able to subscribe to something called an RSS feed, which allows you to automatically download new episodes of something that you can listen to at your leisure. So that could be a podcast, could be a blog, could be something that's out on a website, some news, for example. And they really started to take off. Now, nowadays, of course, there are lots of different ways that you can access podcasts. It's usually done via an app on your phone, or maybe you might want to use like a web-based platform. But the point is, it's never been more accessible and it's never been cheaper to do. It's like free entertainment. Most podcasts, some of them you can pay for, but most of the podcasts are totally free. I don't know if anyone's got a favorite app that they use for podcasting. Sometimes people just use the ones that are bundled with your device, like Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts if you're using Android device, for example, or maybe even Spotify. Andy's saying he uses RSS feeds. This is a really good way to get around things like advertising, for example, on podcasts. I'm a big fan of Castro. I've just switched from Overcast to Castro, and I really like it. It works a bit like an email inbox where you can control what you're listening to next without having to wade through lots of potential noise. Any surprises there? Anyone surprised by any of the labels that you can see on here now? I think Andrew's saying around kind of, YouTube as an example and video podcasts. Now, YouTube is a very interesting one, and it's one that most people are surprised by. Obviously, there are some famous podcasts that have launched on YouTube, such as Diary of a CEO. Lots of podcasts have started putting some of their footage onto YouTube, which is basically just pictures of people or images of people talking to each other. Very rarely anything more engaging than that. However, and this is brand new research. This came out in around August this year. So this is only just sort of launched around this summertime. YouTube has just taken over Spotify and Apple Podcasts as the #1 platform for consuming podcasts. Now, this is true in 3 ways. Firstly, in terms of complete newbies to podcasts. So if you've started to listen to podcasts in the last year, YouTube is a leader. If you're a pioneer, if you have been listening to podcasts for around 4 years, or like me, if you fit into that third bracket over there, a heavy podcast consumer. That reminds me, I should go for a run, actually. If you're a heavy podcast consumer, 6 or so hours in a week, YouTube is the #1 channel. This is really interesting. We'll talk about why in a second. It's also the #1 platform for podcast discovery. So people who are looking at new podcasts or maybe stumbling across a new thing to listen to, YouTube has overtaken Spotify and Apple Podcasts as a discovery medium. Now, you might have your own thoughts about why that might be, but one of the things we'll talk about in today's session is about how you capture a sense of community around a podcast. And when you think about listening to a podcast on something like Apple or Spotify, for example, there's nowhere really for you to put your thoughts or engagement. Yeah, you can write to the hosts, or maybe they have an email address that you can send a message into. But if you've got an instant reaction to something somebody said or something you want to contribute into, there's nothing really there in terms of building a community. YouTube, on one hand, does have that. So if you're watching a podcast or you're listening to an audio podcast that's been uploaded onto YouTube, there's a built-in comment section. There's a built-in community wall where you can absolutely engage with not only the hosts and the presenters and content creators, but also other people who are listening to it. So my thinking is that this is one of the most interesting aspects of where podcasts are going. So if you're thinking about launching a podcast, don't discount YouTube as a platform. Even if you just keep it audio only, there's an awful lot that comes together with being able to broadcast in this way. Cool. Right, let's go to looking at different forms of podcasts. So as we go through these, I'd really love to hear any examples that you can think of different formats of podcasts that fit into these 6 labels that we've got to share here. So first one is the monologue. So in this kind of podcast, you are the expert as the host, and you want to share information on your subject. So monologue formats work really well for that kind of thing. And that can also be entertaining. I've listened to a few comedian podcasts who kind of almost test out their material in this way by talking into the microphone and then presenting that as a podcast episode. Next up, we have multi-host. So this is a kind of podcast that's absolutely perfect if you want to discuss lots of different opinions and maybe swap stories between another host. Also helps in terms of energy. So if you don't think you can fill an entire podcast episode with your own thoughts without maybe some long, awkward pauses, or without maybe losing a bit of energy along the way, it's a really good idea to get another host to join you and then pick up your slack. Next up, we have interview podcasts. So these are really popular, particularly in the learning and development niche and just in the business world in general. And also, this is probably less effort if you're thinking about being a host, because you don't have to be the expert at all. All you need to do is turn up and ask a few good questions and then say goodbye at the end. So the idea here is the host invites a guest onto a podcast, maybe a different guest each week or each episode, and they pose questions, they prompt discussion, and their guests are the experts on that topic. So really, really, really ideal if you know that you've got someone who you can invite on who's a real expert, who's got, or maybe has got an unusual take on a topic that fits into your niche. Next up, roundtable. So this is quite similar to an interview, but except you have multiple guests. So instead of having one expert join you, you get a few, and then you have them discuss the topic together. There's a bit more work here as the host. You've got to do a bit more corralling and a bit more shaping, but the idea is that you would guide them and try your best to keep them on track as they share ideas. As you can see here, even with the setup of this one, technically, there's quite a lot more that goes into a roundtable podcast recording, especially if you're in the same location as them. But they can be really engaging and add lots of variety to listen to. Next up, we have narrative. So narrative kind of combines the interview and the monologue formats. And the idea is that it weaves a story over a series of episodes. So I think somebody in the chat talked about a series a bit earlier on, that the idea that you could have a story that runs over, or a theme that runs over a series. So a popular example you might have heard of is the podcast Serial. And a lot of true crime podcasts take this format where you have a story taking place over 5, 6, 10 episodes. And then you've got built-in engagement because people, assuming it's a good story, people always want to come back and find out what happens next. And then finally, we have documentary. So this incorporates the narrative format, and it kind of takes a much deeper long form dive. And the difference between the two is that usually with documentary formats, you get one story per episode. So these are typically things that are very highly produced with kind of sound bites and having music sound beds and sound effects. Maybe even you get actors in to recreate and reenact things, but they tell a story and bring it to life for the listener. Cool. And then within any of those 6 areas, those podcast formats could be live in front of an audience and recorded exactly as they are, or they can be hosted in a studio. And the studio might be a real studio that we've got in the picture here, or we might find that it's a kind of virtual studio using software like Riverside. Right. Plenty of talking from me. What I would love to know in the chat is, which of those formats, I'll put them back on the screen in a second, which of those formats do you enjoy listening to most? And as a bonus question, can you think of any examples of any titles that fit that format? Yeah, thanks, Jo. So Jo's saying she loves the discussions and interviews. I also really like an interview podcast. That's probably what got me into podcasts originally. I started listening to lots of interview-based formats that really kind of switched me on. And Andy likes a multi-host. Yeah, again, I like to listen to quite a few of those. There's a great radio show called John Robbins and Ellis James, which is transformed into a podcast. I listen to that twice a week. I like it so much. He doesn't podcast so much. There's an amazing, what would I call him? I was going to say he's a bit of a celebrity in the L&D world, but he'd hate that. But there's Ian Pettigrew, also known as Kingfisher Coach. He used to have a podcast called True Strength. And listening to a coach interview someone is absolutely captivating because you get a real sense of what it would be like to be coached by them. He was an absolutely wonderful podcast host, and he got distracted onto some other projects. But if you want to go back and listen to any of his podcast episodes, I would definitely recommend it. I think it's just called True Strength, where he talks them through what their strengths are and kind of using all of his coaching skills, brings out all of these lovely kind of stories about how they bring their strengths to their work. Really, really lovely way of demonstrating what it would be like to be coached by him. Super duper. Thank you for sharing those. Keep on sharing them as we go along. Hopefully for the rest of you who are on the line, you've got some podcasts to listen to as we go through there. Now, why would you look at podcasting for your business? Why podcasting? Hopefully we've understood why now. But first of all, it's a really good way of bringing new leads into your business. So the podcast that I host over in PCS land called the Team Performance Podcast, that was set up about a year ago. And that has more than paid for itself in terms of time and effort, as it's generated a stack of organic leads from people who have just listened to that and then made a decision to buy before even sending an email in. So you get that sense of building a relationship with a whole host of audiences before you've ever met them in real life. Secondly, obviously websites love new content. So if you add links to your podcasts and maybe different episodes on your website, it can be a really good way to boost traffic back to your products and services. So most podcasts allow you to chop up the material into little clips or little sound bites, even as transcript, and you can use that to generate blog posts, short audio versions, and lots more. And then in terms of building your business, building your brand, and your personal brand, podcasts are amazing for doing that. They're much easier than learning how to become a TED speaker or paying to get on a panel at a massive industry conference. And you're more likely to be seen and heard by more people. So you've got a much larger reach. I think also, if you can become known as someone who's really comfortable in that podcasting space, which is basically turning up and talking into a microphone for 15, 20 minutes, you'll usually get invited onto other people's podcasts, and that will help boost your credibility and your kind of presence, and you'll learn new tricks even more. And then finally, I think there are lots of traditional methods of building content that reinforces your business, like writing a book or creating a whole series of videos. It takes a long time to do both of those things. Writing a book could take months, maybe even years. Video content, it's got to be high quality. So you want to be looking at booking studio space, learning how to talk to a camera, scripting some content, and more. Creating a podcast, even if you just do a limited edition run of 6 or 10 episodes, it's so simple, it's so accessible, and in a lot of ways, other than your time, it can be free. And just going beyond that, podcasting can become a business in its own right. So you have to put in the hard hours to actually build an audience and grow an audience. But once you've done that, you can advertise on a podcast. So you have people coming to pay for a advertising slot. So if somebody mentioned The Rest is Politics on the channel, they have 1 or 2 advertising slots per episode, and they will probably charge anywhere between £5,000 to £10,000 per episode for that space, because they know they've got an enormous listener base. Memberships are another way that you can get involved with actually making the podcast pay for itself. So I know some people who run podcasts where they have sort of tiered levels. So there's a free version that's maybe 15 minutes, but if people want even more, they can get a 45-minute kind of director's cut version every episode, and that's accessible to them if they pay a monthly membership. And then almost going backwards. So Helen's just mentioned Tim Ferriss. Thank you, Helen. I promise I haven't paid you to say this, but he released a book after making his podcast. So he wrote a book that then became a podcast, 4-Hour Work Week. And then all of his interviews over some years, he basically had them transcribed into a series of chapters in a book. So there's Tools of Titans, and there's also Tribe of Mentors, which is the follow-up. But it's basically just his entire podcast, a catalogue turned into a book. Incredible. And your publisher will love you because you've got a built-in audience. You know that there's going to be a dedicated group of people who will want to buy it. And then, of course, you can promote your services to listeners. So that could be very explicit and direct. You can sort of showcase yourself as a coach or a consultant or a writer, but also people do pay for podcasters. So if you want to act as a host, or maybe even if you've developed a load of production skills with podcasting, that can then become a bit of a business in its own right. So there are lots of ways that you might want to start a podcast to sort of generate activity, engagement, and revenue for your own business. Right, let's have a look at why podcasts fail. And there are 3 broad reasons, 3 main causes of death for a podcast. And the first one is consistency. And behind that is really, it's burnout. So I probably made it sound quite easy to release a podcast. And certainly it is easier than writing a book or developing a whole bunch of video content every week or every month. But the reality is it does require a lot of work. You've got to research it, you've got to edit it, you've got to publish it, and then promote it, and then do that all over again every time you have a new episode. It's a huge, huge task. And the podcasts that are huge, they're huge in the general that you'll see top of the charts, the likes of Rest is Politics, for example, they have huge teams behind them. Now, committing to a podcast is something I often kind of caution people against, particularly if you're looking at doing something weekly or bi-weekly, because it is like giving birth to one of these things. I don't know if you've ever seen one of these before, but they're all over the place. I call it the content monster. So if you give birth to a content monster, they need feeding all the time. They are super hungry. And they feed on your ideas, they feed on your time, and they feed on your energy. And that might be at the expense of some of the other things that are in your business. If you're a sole trader, freelancer, not so good. So I do caution people against going straight into podcasting and launching a weekly series or a bi-weekly series, because it's an awful lot to take on. Monthly is fine. A couple of times a month, also fine. And the great thing is, before you launch podcasts, you get to decide when that content monster needs feeding. You get to decide that ahead of time. Now, the key thing to remember, I think, is that even if you are putting out episodes every week, it doesn't mean that your audience will listen to them on the exact day of release. So they might save them up and listen to them in huge binge sessions, or maybe a day or two after they've been published, or maybe even a week after they've been published. They're kind of evergreen content, ideally. So as we talked about earlier on, podcasts get consumed on the listener's terms, not on the creator's terms. So you don't have to jump on this huge content hamster wheel. It's also fine to take a bit of a break. Andrew's saying here, yeah, suggest start with a season of 6 to 8. Absolutely. See if you can manage the workload. If you're super clever about it, record all 6 episodes before you launch the podcast. Then you don't need to worry about getting into that cycle of record, edit, publish. Just do the whole thing before you launch it, and then you can just sit back and look after the promotion side in a more organic way. Next up, number 2. There is the problem of the mysterious creature. I'm going to tell you about that in just a second. But before we do, I wanted to play a game. I am going to describe an animal to you, and I want you to guess in the chat what this animal is. It is a very mysterious animal, but it is a real animal. So it's not this woman, by the way. She's not the animal. She's not the mysterious creature. She's looking at it. In fact, she's holding it. Okay. Anyone want to go early? You can commit early, or you can commit late. It's up to you. Okay, this creature has got no stomach. This creature is venomous. This creature fires electronic pulses out of its head to attract prey. This creature has got 2 layers of fur. This creature is carnivorous. Scientists have discovered that when you put this creature under ultraviolet light, they glow, and nobody knows why. Their babies are called puggles, and they have no teeth as adults, but they do when they are babies. No guesses so far. Last one. When they were discovered, scientists thought they were a hoax, and somebody had stitched a load of different animals together. Okay. Joe says ants. They have 2 layers of fur. I suppose ants are kind of slightly furry, aren't they? Okay. Oh, Andy. Gold star for Andy. It is. It is a platypus. And yeah, they are. They're super cute, but they're also very weird. My biggest, if you take nothing away from today's session, don't make your podcast a platypus. So there are loads of podcasts out there that I would probably put in this bracket, where probably their inception was sitting around having coffee one day, somebody suggested something and went, oh, there's probably a podcast in that. I'll make that podcast, without ever researching it, testing it out, seeing what the audience was, and maybe sort of diving around between lots of different topics and just being one person talking about a particular theme every week. Ideally, a business podcast needs to be in line with your offer as a business. Yeah, don't make a platypus. They're really confusing. And then finally, engagement can be an issue. Do you remember that meme that I shared right at the start of the session? This guy. This is how it should feel. The face, the feeling, that sense of being part of it. And in order to make people feel like that, there are all kinds of things that you can do. It might mean holding some stuff back, so that people, ideally, they feel like they're the expert listening in. So I know some more about this. I want to get involved. I want to share some stuff, whether it's a comment or a piece of research or my own personal story. That's a great way to encourage engagement. It also might involve sometimes occasionally taking some more controversial standpoints, or maybe some hot takes on kind of issues that are going on at the moment. Or you can just be really direct and ask for comments, questions from your audience. I think Andrew was saying earlier on, maybe starting with a series of 6 to 8. So you could do a series of 6 episodes, ask people for questions all the way along, and then episode 7 could be you opening the mailbox and seeing what people have got to say, and referencing back some of those earlier episodes. So that could be a really easy win in terms of building a community and helping your audience feel part of it. So yeah, consistency, creatures, and community. I mean, I guess in an ideal world, your engagement metric should be that people get in touch with you to buy your services or book you. A podcasts are a really good way to showcase your skill and your expertise. But if you give away too much, people will generally feel that they've I've got the idea here, and they might not be intrigued enough or curious enough to learn more about that. Okay. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I've put some resources aside for you to download afterwards. But there's a great video by a YouTube creator called Ed, where he talks about how to sell services on lots of different mediums, including YouTube, but also it would work for podcasts. This idea that when you have an audience, you're constantly kind of topping up this glass, and in the glass is value. So you can give them some content, usually, but it has to be free, really. Give them some insights, give them some ideas, give them something to be working on, and you are building up your trust and your authenticity and credibility. Once that glass is full, it's probably a good time to ask them for something, whether it's to book a call with you or to buy a product, buy a service. But every time you do that, it takes some water from the glass, and you have to then spend time topping it back up again. If you continually ask and ask and ask and ask, this will be empty, and people will just feel a bit icky that you are constantly asking them for their money. So there is this constant exchange of value between the creator and their audience that you need to be aware of, and make sure that you're not imbalancing through your kind of thoughts and your words as part of the content you're creating. Something to think about, and I would definitely recommend watching Ed's video on that, which I'll share with you after we've finished. Now, as promised, we're going to talk about your superpower. There's a really simple method, simple process for thinking this through. We're going to do some of it on the webinar today, and then I'm going to leave a download so that you can do some more thinking after the session. Now, the good news is I would pretty much guarantee that every single person on this call has got one of these. You might even have multiple superpowers, but we only need one. And we certainly only need to talk about one. Otherwise, we might be in danger of becoming a platypus, which we don't want. So if you haven't already got one, grab a pencil and paper, or maybe open a note up on your computer or your phone, and get ready to brainstorm this one. So Joe's saying, but Superman has got so many superpowers, right? I mean, and if you're being really pernickety, Batman's not a superhero because he's got no superpowers. But apart from the fact that he's rich, it's probably the fact that makes Superman so confusing and probably a little bit dull. He's too powerful. The ones that are really interesting just have one power and lots of weaknesses. So, stage one. If you're feeling brave, feel free to do this live in the chat, by the way. What is the thing that you're most passionate about? Write it down or capture it somewhere. Next stage, can you think of the biggest problem that you've solved in your own life that relates to that passion? Joe said getting through her emails. I mean, fair enough. In fact, actually, I know you were half joking there, Joe, but I'm going to pick that as an example. And then how did you solve it? I think we all really want to know this one, Joe. How did you get through your 400 plus emails every day on Trading Journal? Oh, I never do. Okay. The never-ending game, as I've heard email called, the infinite game of emails. That's one for another webinar, I think. Okay. Anyone else, if you're feeling brave about sharing, if you've captured something, what we're trying to do here is connect your story of overcoming something with your passion, and also demonstrating to people that you've got a system of overcoming it? Can you find something that connects all of those three things? Doesn't need to be perfect, but if you have got any thoughts on this one, feel free to drop it into the chat. As you're doing that, we'll move on to stage 2, which is obviously a superhero needs someone that they can rescue, right? So you need to identify the who. Who are you going to be rescuing with your superpower? And here, just try and list one person. It might be lots of people, but just try and think about one person that your superpower can rescue. You can be specific about that if you want. So it could be women aged 50 plus, or it could be athletes, it could be CEOs, whatever you like. What's the one person that your superpower can rescue? And also, what is their problem? What's their biggest problem, actually, more specifically? Once you've done that, you should be able to very easily and quickly articulate the following sentence, which is, I help, insert your person to be rescued, and then insert the result that they want. I see these all the time now over LinkedIn, but I rarely see them in the podcasting space. So an example of this could be, I help semi-professional sports people avoid career-ending injuries. Or I help PhD students learn 10 times faster. Or let's go with Joe's. I'm having a quick crack at Joe's here. I help publishing executives deal with email overwhelm. Something like that. And I've got a 12-step process to do it. Something like that. Like, as Kim says, yeah, it is. It's a bit like a mini elevator pitch. Do we have anyone else? Has anyone else done the thinking yet? Has anyone else sort of got some rough thoughts together around what your superpower is versus who are you rescuing? I'd love to see any thoughts in the chat there, if you have. I'll leave these prompts up on the download so you can get a copy of these if you want to go off away and do some of this work away from the confines of the webinar today. Oh, Kim, I help L&D freelancers connect and thrive. I love that. It's really big, powerful language, is that, around around thriving. I think people would really connect with that. And again, you're probably dealing with the problem there. The problem is I feel disconnected, or I feel a bit isolated. So if you're helping them feel more connected, again, you're sort of speaking very specifically to their problem. I think that's really powerful. Yeah, creating a space to amplify women's voices. Love that, Andrew. Thank you. David, I help leaders change their brain. Oh, that's cool. And behavior to get better personal, team, and business results. Love it. Yeah, really, really cool. So again, it gives an indication about how you're doing it without giving them the actual answer to what you're going to be doing with them. Really, really cool. Right. So we're going to dive a lot deeper into this as part of our 6-week podcast bootcamp, particularly the next 3 steps, which are about further refining the problem, and actually searching for the problem before their problem. So in David's case, it could be about, well, why do they need to change their brain? What's the problem behind that might lead them to want to change their brain and their behavior? So we do a lot of that thinking on the bootcamp, but actually stage 1 and 2, you've done a lot of that's going to get you 90% of the way there, I would say, if you're thinking about starting a podcast. Stage 4 is then again about getting really good at articulating what that superpower is and refining it down into something that's really catchy, curious, and intriguing. And then, of course, stage 5 is going out to research it all and find out who the audience is, what results do they want to achieve, and then find out if your podcast superpower is currently in high demand. You see, I reckon, Joe, there's probably going to be a demand for people who are dealing with email overwhelm. I think you'd be talking about a really broad audience there of people who'd want to talk about that problem, have a bit of a rant about that problem, and then talk about ways to deal with it. There's got to be a podcast in that. Once you've done all of that work, you can start picking up a microphone and building the podcast, but there's no point picking up a microphone at all until all of this stuff is in place. And that's probably one of the biggest mistakes a lot of podcasters make. They're so excited to go away and start making things without putting all of the strategy and research in place first. Okie dokie. So quick recap. Podcasts come in lots of different formats. We've explored six of them, times two. They're a hugely powerful force that can transform your business and brand and bring revenue into your business. Number 3, don't make platypuses. They're really confusing. Number 4, keep things consistent. By the way, that doesn't mean sticking to a theme. So you can explore lots of different themes, but actually having a consistent schedule for publishing is really important. And if you change that schedule, you'll let people know. Bake in community, design with it all in mind. There's lots of ways that we can do that, which we talk about on the bootcamp. And then finally, build a podcast that plays to your podcast superpower. And I promise you'll never, ever be bored creating an episode again. Now, if you want to learn a bit more about this, we are running a podcast bootcamp as part of L&D Free Spirits. It's a 6-week course, starts in about a month's time. It finishes on the 13th of December. Now, if you are doing your maths, you'll find that that's actually a 7-week period, but actually we do have a week's break, and in that week you will go off and make your first episode, and we'll feed back on it all in the final week. But the whole idea is taking you from that place of clarifying what your purpose of a podcast should be for you, getting down into your target audience, doing all that essential research work. Then we do the technical side of it. So we'll talk about recording techniques, editing techniques, and ideally pretty simple ones that mean you don't have to go off and buy lots of expensive equipment or spend time learning how to become an audio engineer, but just allow you to get good quality content out there. And then we'll do stuff around your podcast branding, build a strategy for launching it. And then by the end of it, you will have planned and produced your first episode in a way that keeps listeners coming back. And we are capping numbers. The reason for that is that we wanted to keep this as a really tight, close cohort where we constantly be providing feedback and suggestions, advice to one another, so that, you know, this is a live course with lots of kind of work that goes on in between the live sessions. So it's $499 if you're not a member of L&D Free Spirits, or it's $299 if you are a member. You get a really nice discount. Okie dokie. Right, I'm going to come on to some questions. We've got a minute or so for some questions. I'm happy to stick around for a bit longer, folks, if you want. Before I do, though, I promised that I would give you some resources, research, or you can zap the QR code on screen. So there's a link to all of the research around sort of YouTube, Spotify, Apple. There's a link to that the value proposition video that I talked about, and much more. Plus, you can download the visuals that I was working with from today as well. Kim, did we have any questions that have come through over the courses of the session that we maybe need to dive into?
Andrew put a question in that the first question he gets asked is, what mic should you have? And I will just say, I'm not a podcast wizard, but do not use the mic on your webcam because it'll be naff. So I'm just going to put that out there.
Do you remember what advice I gave to you, Kim, when we recorded our podcast episode a little while ago?
Swallow the microphone.
Yeah, basically. Any mic that is as close to your mouth as possible will be the best quality mic you can get. So you can buy, you know,
I don't know,
£10, £20 mics on Amazon, and it will sound better than you using your built-in microphone on your webcam on your laptop, because it's usually a good distance away from you, so it brings in all the echo from your room. Whereas you can see the one that I'm using today is from Rode. This is called the Pod mic. And
mine's an Amazon 20 quid one, and you can see it's not great, but does the job.
I mean, I said this earlier on. I think if you can start a podcast relatively cheaply, and then you can scale up your production value as you go along. But if you spend money on anything, spend some money on a microphone, because it'll make an enormous difference. Hopefully that helps with the question. But yeah, literally anything except whatever's built in to your computer will do a better job.
Okay. While we're waiting for some other questions to come through, what would you say is the ideal length of a podcast, or does it depend what the content is?
Yeah. This is a horrible cop-out answer to that question, isn't it, Kim? But it depends on your audience. Your audience might be the kind of person who always consumes podcasts while they're on their commute every morning, in which case you might want to think about 20 minutes, 25 minutes tops. But if your audience is really up for a deep dive on a topic, it's totally fine to go for 45-minute, hour-long episodes and just assume they're either listening to them on a train journey or on a flight, maybe, or they might listen to them in a bunch of different sittings. But it's about getting to know your audience. What do they want? What do they need? For me personally, I'm actually, back to I think Helen referenced this, Tim Ferriss, like he puts out podcast episodes that are like 2 or 3 hours long. Like, I'm never going to sit around and watch that in one go. But I do. I save them up and I listen to them over the course of a day in different sittings, and that's absolutely fine. Maybe making some notes as I go. Yeah, David says Huberman does 2 hours. I listen to the film magazine Empire have a podcast that you subscribe to. So it's a membership podcast, and they do kind of spoiler themed interviews with directors and cast members of films. And they the last series of Mission Impossible films, they filmed, I think, 16 hours worth of interviews with the director, which which sounds crazy, but yeah, people turn up and they will listen to it all eventually because they want that extra piece of insight and information. They know their audience really well. Yeah, hardcore history, seasons of 4 to 6 podcasts with 3 to 5 hours each. Amazing. Yeah, really good example, Andrew. So I would absolutely say things like history podcasts fit very neatly into kind of documentary, that documentary format. And it's absolutely normal to find things that are longer than a film. And people listen to them on car journeys, on plane rides, train journeys. It's a really good way to just get lost in a story. Super, folks. Well, I don't think we've got any other questions. If you do have any, please don't hesitate to get in touch. You'll find me on LinkedIn. It's probably the easiest way to get in touch with me about any of the content we've covered today. Just I want to say a big thank you to Kim as well for hosting and being there on the back channel, fielding those and also curating all of those, the podcasts that we can go off and unsubscribe to after we've finished up here. Thank you so much, Kim.
Very welcome. It's been fabulous. I've learned a lot. Thank you so much.